Chapter 2, The Ties That Bind. Narcotics Anonymous is a program of action, not theory. We don't think our way into a new way of living. We live our way into a new way of thinking. Before we got clean, our identity was built on fantasy. Who we could be, would be, should be, or even who we used to be. In recovery, we connect with reality through action. We show up and do our part. We experiment with jobs, relationships, and service commitments. Some of us begin simply by trying to keep a houseplant alive. Wherever we start, each of us ventures out into the world, clean, and tries something new. We learn who we are by taking a stand, taking risks, and allowing ourselves to be vulnerable. Even when we make mistakes, we can learn something vital about ourselves. We identify as addicts, and the principle of autonomy teaches us that this is the most important thing. If we forget we have a deadly disease, it doesn't really matter who or what else we think we are. But once we are clear about that and get used to the idea of being clean, all kinds of possibilities open up to us. As recovering addicts, we are free to explore the world and to consider who we are and who we want to become. An experienced member suggested that the whole trick to living is figuring out who we are and doing it on purpose. Connection to ourselves. It can take a long time to set ourselves free. When we come to recovery, we have been devastated in many ways. Although living clean isn't all about crisis, it can sometimes seem that way. Our feelings are so powerful. There is so much change in our lives, and change can be messy, even when it's positive. Our personalities and our sense of who we are were warped by our addiction, and when we get clean, we are even more confused. It can be a while before we have the opportunity, or the need, to ask, okay, who am I now? We change in recovery, but we also uncover who we were all along. We find ourselves. For many of us, this is the restoration the second step talks about. It may even be a restoration to a state we've never experienced before, because we've never had the chance to be ourselves, without pretending, without hiding, without trying to be something else. There may be many different ways we describe ourselves, and the ones that seem most important can change depending on where we are in our lives. Identity is a confusing word. It indicates the things that make us different from each other, and the things that make us exactly the same. Our identity is composed of things that distinguish us either as part of a group or as separate from it. We are as different as our stories, but our literature reminds us that addiction makes us one of a kind. At some point, our identity as using addicts came to define us. At the end of the road, it seemed like we were nothing but our addiction. As we stay clean, we begin to discover who we are. Some of us return to an identity we once knew and had lost. Others of us come into the process uncertain of who we might be. Experiences from our past can make it hard for some of us to see ourselves in new ways. The labels we have applied to ourselves don't allow us to change. Powerful emotional experiences can shape our identity. Sometimes they seem to define us. Those experiences made us who we are, and we embrace them. For that matter, we might not want to see ourselves otherwise. Sometimes we are simply stuck in unresolved past experiences like abuse, prison, or the death of someone we love. How do we reconcile who we have been with who we are becoming in recovery? We want to be free of our past without missing any opportunities to learn from it. Sometimes it can take a while for our sense of ourselves to catch up to who we are. We may even sabotage ourselves to return to familiar chaos or pain when our lives start seeming too different from what they had been. Gradually, we learn that much of the unmanageability we struggle with is the result of the choices we make. When we begin to get comfortable with new choices, our lives change, sometimes radically. What makes us happiest are things it may never have occurred to us to want. Some of us have the experience of lost dreams awakening, picking up our desires where we left them and finally living the lives we had always wanted. Others of us find that the dreams we left behind no longer fit the people we have become. We come in with a incredible history of broken promises and broken dreams, of dishonesty, betrayal, and failure. Believing we are worthy of the things we want can be its own process. We may have been afraid to dream at all. Some of us punish ourselves in recovery for years, holding ourselves back from joy because we feel we don't deserve it. The tools and the love we find in NA can help us break these patterns, no matter how long we've been living with them. We can get stuck in patterns so quickly. Vigilance is necessary to keep old patterns from resurfacing. Something needs to break the circuit of our negative thinking. It may be an action we take, like meditating or going to a meeting. It may be an action someone else takes. Our friends and sponsors come to know us well enough to recognize when we are off course and help us to make a shift. When we are living just for today, we find courage that we never expected, and we can go forward into our lives with joy, excitement, and great hope for what is possible. But when we dwell in the past or worry about the future, we find ourselves trapped again, almost before we know what happened. There is no single easy answer to how we make peace with our past, and it rarely happens at all. Throughout our recovery, different pieces of ourselves become available to us, and other parts are ready to let go. Sometimes this is a peaceful process, and sometimes it's terrifying. The fact that something does not get resolved in one round of steps or in a few conversations with our sponsor does not mean we are not progressing. Returning again and again in step work or in dreams to the scene of the crime is part of the experience many of us share in recovery. Each step we work gives us back a piece of ourselves and relieves a little of our burden of regret, shame, and fear. We let go of some things we believed about ourselves and find others. We return to some of the things we once cherished and find out if they still suit us today. The ways we change can be surprising. We leave pieces behind along the way. It is almost like a children's game. With each step forward, we must turn around and retrieve a piece of our past. Defects of character are removed, but other things are as well. We change jobs and find out how much of our identity was tied up in what we did for a living. Or we experience a change in our relationship and find that it changes us in other ways as well. This can be upsetting. We may not want to admit that what worked for us yesterday is no longer in our best interests. As we start to know ourselves, we may be afraid to keep growing because it opens up the possibility that we might lose the self we have only just gotten to know. Experience teaches us that the more willing we are to move forward in our lives, the more fully we become ourselves. We learn what is true for us by going through difficulty, staying clean, and looking back on the experience. We may think we are the ones being tested, but the reality is that we are continually testing our faith and understanding against our experience. When we go through difficulty in recovery, it can feel like we are in the same place we were before we got clean. And while sometimes we recreate old experiences in our new lives, more often we mistake a temporary difficulty for a permanent condition. The simple act of accepting ourselves changes us. We start treating ourselves better, and we respond to the world with a new humility. The basic text says in the 8th step, we want to look the world in the eye with neither aggressiveness nor fear. As we clean up our wreckage and live differently, we can respect our actions and find respect for ourselves in the process. Part of the charm of many of our more experienced members is that they can seem so eccentric. One suggested that this was a consequence of no longer having defenses in the way. More and more we are comfortable just being ourselves. We appear in the world exactly as we are. That freedom is part of the promise of our third tradition, because we have only one requirement for membership, the desire to stop using. We are given permission to be who we are. We no longer have to lie to gain acceptance.